but no less startling conclusions about what exactly happened 2,000 years ago.
You read the story of the empty tomb, and on Friday someone is killed, and on Sunday they're gone from the tomb, and you ask the question, what might have happened? Either God raised him from the dead, which is the traditional Christian affirmation, or the body was carried away by someone, body stolen.
But there is another possibility. The Gospels describe how, after his resurrection, Jesus ate, drank, and Thomas could touch his wounds. It's therefore perhaps not surprising that some people who've looked for natural explanations of miracles have suggested that Jesus was alive because he didn't die on the cross.
There are many versions of that story. One came up in a book years ago called The Passover Plot, which suggested that he had been sedated on the cross, that he was removed quite early, and therefore could well have survived. That's certainly a possibility.
The disciples did manage to give Jesus some kind of substance on a sponge. They filled a sponge with vinegar and put it upon hyssop and put it to his mouth. And Jesus immediately died after taking this substance. When Jesus had received the vinegar, he said, "It is finished." But oddly enough, it isn't necessary to suggest that Jesus was sedated or drugged by whatever was on the sponge in order to believe that he could have survived. There are stories of people who did survive crucifixion. The Jewish historian Josephus wrote of one of his own friends surviving crucifixion in Palestine in the 1st century.
He's traveling out to a village named Tekoa to scout land for a Roman camp. And he notices that 3 of his friends are hanging on crosses. So he requests that they be allowed to, that they be brought down. And Titus, the Roman general, gives him permission. The 3 are brought down immediately and given medical care. And 2 of them died, but the 3rd survived.
So is it possible that Jesus survived? Certainly his crucifixion was speedily executed, perhaps too speedily.
When you look at the story of Jesus and how he was executed by the Romans, he's on the cross for 6 hours. The assumption is that he's dead. The Roman soldiers checked the body. There were 2 others crucified according to the gospel accounts. And they broke the legs of those to hasten their death because the Sabbath day was coming. When they came to Jesus, they said he's already dead. Presumably, his body's motionless, he's quit breathing. They then prepare the body and put him in a tomb. And presumably it's sealed up and he's dead for all practical purposes. The question, though, is he clinically dead?
The question of clinical death is certainly raised by the fact that the herbs which Joseph of Arimathea took into the tomb with the body of Jesus were aloes. These are healing, not embalming herbs.
We do have stories, both from the modern world and from the ancient world, where people appear to be dead, and for all practical purposes they are dead. That is, they're not responding to the outside world, but then they do, in fact, revive or come back. We call it resuscitation, but if you want to press the language, that would be resurrection.
The idea that Jesus might have survived the crucifixion rather than risen from the dead seems provocative. But all the Gospels are quite clear that the disciples saw Jesus as if he were alive. If Jesus did survive, it does not necessarily mean that the resurrection story was a hoax or a deliberate falsehood. At the end of the 19th century, the English writer Samuel Butler, in his book on the resurrection, came up with the theory that if Jesus had collapsed into a shock-induced coma on the cross and then recovered in the tomb, he and his disciples would actually have thought his recovery was a miraculous resurrection.
But still has great credibility if you see it in the light, for instance, of more contemporary developments. Look at the near-death experience in the United States. Something like 13 million people in the United States say they've had near-death experiences. They've seen this white light. They believe it to be some form of miracle. So the idea that in the first century, when they had none of this scientific insight and they had none of these hospitals or whatever to save them, that people thought it, actually makes a lot of sense. Doesn't make them fraudsters or shysters. It actually makes them genuine people who thought they'd witnessed a miracle.
Whatever the circumstances, if Jesus was alive, then he and his disciples face a serious problem.
If Jesus was placed in the tomb and somehow was revived, he himself would certainly think that was an act of the grace of God. I came right to the bars of death and was brought back. But now there's a practical problem. It's a political problem, actually. Romans basically do one thing to messiahs. They crucify them.
If Jesus did indeed survive crucifixion, either through resurrection, as the Bible tells us, or more controversially, through resuscitation, then he is once more a condemned man. The Bible is said to solve this problem with a miracle called the Ascension. Jesus is taken bodily into heaven. But the interesting fact is that the Ascension does not actually appear in the original form of the Gospels. The Ascension references in Mark are among the verses which, as we've seen, were added 200 years later. There is one line in Luke which reads, "and was carried up into heaven." But again, this does not appear in all Bibles. It was in fact inserted, simply because the Ascension is referred to in a later book of the Bible, the Acts of the Apostles, and it's always been assumed that Luke was the author of the Acts. There's no Ascension in Matthew, and John's Gospel ends with the enigmatic words, "and there are also many other things which Jesus did, the which, if they should be written every one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that would be written." So what was it that Jesus did? One of the stories that emerges from this question depends upon the idea that Jesus' relationship with Mary Magdalene was a very special one.
If you read John's Gospel, the first person who saw the risen Christ, i.e. the first Christian, was Mary Magdalene. So I think when the church tries to sideline the idea that Jesus had relationships with women, that he had close relationships with women, it's laughable, really. I mean, it's part of this problem that they always say that that the thing that non-believers find hardest about Jesus was his divinity, and the thing that Christians always find hardest about Jesus was his humanity. I mean, he was a man. I'm perfectly happy with the concept that Jesus had a relationship with Mary Magdalene, that it was long and important and, you know, was one of the dominant things in his life. He was human.
The idea, of course, that Jesus may have had a very special relationship with Mary may be offensive to many Christians, but some historians have gone even further. They've suggested that Jesus and Mary might have married, that they might even have had children. So if we're trying to find out where, in his flight from the Romans, Jesus could have gone, perhaps we should start by finding out where Mary went. There is a tradition that some years after the crucifixion, Mary Magdalene came to the Camargue region of the south of France. Here she lived and died, and the Basilica Sainte Marie Madeleine is a shrine to her memory. This was the center of what became known as the cult of the Magdalene.
The cult of the Magdalene was very powerful in France up until the Middle Ages. The faithful wanted to believe in a mother figure, and the church were very anxious that they should not believe in Mary Magdalene as having been a mother figure for obvious reasons, which were that she might have been the spouse of Christ, that she might have had his child, that she might have produced a bloodline.
The local legend describes how Mary Magdalene came here with her brother Lazarus and her sister Martha and a few companions. If the relationship between Jesus and Mary was as close as some sources suggest, perhaps one of those companions, traveling incognito for fear of arrest by the Romans, was Jesus himself.
Jesus could have taken ship at Caesarea or one of the smaller ports up the Syrian coast, and he could have left for another life. And he could well have arrived, as a lot of people believe, in this part of France and begun a new life. He could even have brought his family with him. So these stories could have a historical foundation.
After her death, Mary Magdalene's relics were placed in a sarcophagus and then hidden. It was not until 1279 that they were rediscovered, and this basilica was built for their safekeeping. Sealed within the crypt, in the center of the church, is what is claimed to be the skull of Mary Magdalene. The idea that Jesus went to the south of France may seem far-fetched. After all, if any of the stories were true, it's hard to believe that the original writers of the Gospels could have completely eradicated all of the evidence. If the faithful knew that Jesus was in fact still alive, surely they would have shared that knowledge. And surely they must have hoped that at some time in the future it would have been safe for Jesus to return. And evidence for that hope should be somewhere in the original text. The disciples were expecting Jesus to return. They were expecting what has become known as the second coming. And this was not necessarily going to be a miraculous return.
Jesus definitely went away. Whatever view of resurrection you take, resuscitation or divine miracle, in the traditional sense of belief in resurrection, he goes away. He says, I'm going away. The disciples say, can we come? He says, no. And he says, I'm going to come again. Now, what's interesting about that is normally, if someone says they're going away, and they're going to come back, and you're sort of looking at your watch or your calendar, wondering, okay, he said he went away, he's going to come back, you'd take it in that everyday sense.
The concept of the heavenly second coming, of Jesus returning on the day of judgment, was only created after it was clear that Jesus had not returned in that everyday sense. But if Jesus did decide to leave Palestine, France still doesn't seem like a likely destination. It was, after all, a Roman colony. Some claim that if Jesus did survive the crucifixion, his first priority would be to escape from the clutches of the Romans.
Jesus, I think, would have to leave the territory. And we have to ask the question, where would he go? And you just look at a map. Palestine is on the far eastern border of the Roman Empire. If you go west, you're going right into the heart of Roman territory, where we have our 15 legions stationed around the world. If you go east, you're crossing over into Parthia, and you're going towards Persia eventually, and India and Afghanistan, that direction.
But apart from escaping rearrest, why would Jesus travel east? And how would he get there? If Jesus did want to travel east, away from the Roman Empire, the journey from Israel was surprisingly easy by land or by sea, on the Silk Route or the Spice Route. It's an accepted fact, for instance, that the disciple Thomas traveled to India and founded a Christian church there.
The great tradition of the Indian church is that it was founded by Thomas the Apostle. To travel to India would be no problem. He just had to go down to Gaza, link up with one of the spice trains returning, and then from Yemen get a boat to India. It would have been a very simple, easy procedure that was done regularly.
And there's another reason why Jesus might have been tempted to go east. But to understand that, we have to go back to the year of his birth. We all recognize the story in Matthew's Gospel of the 3 wise men from the east who followed a star and presented themselves and their gifts to the baby Jesus. What we perhaps don't recognize immediately is the similarity between this story and the traditions of a religion that is 500 years older than Christianity: Buddhism. When a great Buddhist holy man or lama dies, wise men consult the stars and other omens and set off, often on extraordinarily long journeys, to find the infant who is the reincarnation of the lama. When the child is old enough, he's taken away from his parents and educated in the Buddhist faith. Could this be the origin of the story of the three wise men? Could Jesus have been taken to India as a child and taught as a Buddhist? The Russian writer Nikolai Notovich, traveling in India in the 19th century, discovered an ancient manuscript in a Buddhist monastery in Tibet. In his book, The Unknown Life of Jesus Christ, Notovich translated this manuscript, and it tells of a divine child called Isa, born in the 1st century, to a poor family in Israel. Isa came to India at the age of 14, where he learned the laws of Buddhism before returning to Israel at the age of 29. This idea would certainly explain the otherwise odd fact that from the age of 14 to 29, there's absolutely no record of Jesus' existence in Palestine. Certainly Jesus' later teaching and miracles have uncanny parallels with the teaching and miracles of the Buddha. Loving your enemies and the idea that the meek will inherit the earth have absolutely no tradition in the Jewish religion, but are entirely consistent with Buddhism. And the Buddha was known to walk on water and miraculously to feed many hundreds of his disciples with only a few scraps of food. But if Jesus traveled or returned to the East, surely there would be legends like those in the south of France to support the idea. And of course there are such traditions. The people here in Kashmir call their tribe Ben-e-Israel and claim to be descendants of the lost tribes. And here there are stories that the 1st century preacher Isa, known locally as Yusasaf, meaning leader of the healed, returned to Kashmir in his 30s. Yusasaf's ministry here can easily be seen as a continuation of the Jesus ministry. And in a local temple called the Temple of Solomon, there used to be an inscription which told of Yusasaf's claim around the year 50 AD to be Jesus, the prophet from Israel. Kashmiri history books tell us that Yusasaf came from abroad. He was a prophet and a messenger. He came from Israel. He came to spread his teachings. He lived and died here. He is Jesus. He is Isa. The meaning of Yusasaf is the healer. Another meaning is the shepherd, one who teaches others. And our history books confirm that Isa was known as Yusasaf here in Kashmir. Yusasaf continued to teach and preach in Kashmir until he died around the year 80 AD. He was buried in Srinagar. And this, they say, is Yusasaf's tomb. The first building erected around this site was built in 112 AD. In fact, it's now a shared gravesite. In the 15th century, the Islamic holy man Syed Nazir-ud-Din was also buried here. Although both gravestones under the cloth point north-south in the Islamic tradition, the body of Yusasaf is buried beneath in a grave dug east-west in the Jewish tradition. Next to the sarcophagus are two carved footprints. The marks on these are said to be the symbolic representations of the scars of crucifixion.
The
footprints were carved as a sign. The scars are clearly visible, received when he was nailed to the cross. They show that this is the same person who came from Israel and that he lived and died here. You won't find any footprints like these anywhere else in Kashmir. We don't have that tradition. The position of the scars, just behind the toes, do not match each other, but they would align if a single nail was driven through both feet with the left foot placed over the right. There are many who believe this tomb to be the tomb of Jesus. If this is the tomb of Jesus, then he spent most of his life in the mountain kingdom of Kashmir. He did not die on the cross. There was no resurrection. He did not ascend into heaven, and he does not sit at the right hand of God. For many Christians, this would be the end of Christianity as we know it. But for some, the original story would still have a poetic power.
For me, the resurrection is about death. The two things that will happen to us all in our life is that we'll be born and that we'll die. They're the two things we know nothing about. And we have this great void before and we have this great void afterwards. So any system of belief, any religion, any church that set itself up has always had to have some concept, some way of dealing with death. So in Jesus' resurrection at the end of the Easter story is the symbolism of our own resurrection, of our own new life. That in many ways is the great strength of Christianity, and I think to kind of get away from it, to get away from that incredibly powerful symbolism of the resurrection that touches each and every one of us because of the reality of what will happen to us, and start debating whether, you know, bones in a tomb matter or whether it actually happened, completely misses the point of Christianity.
And there will always be those for whom none of the inconsistencies and anomalies in the Gospels mean anything. For them, the story still has the hallmarks of truth, of gospel truth.
I understand that people find it difficult to believe because we know these things don't happen. If you think that you've just seen somebody who was dead now alive again, you say, well, take 2 aspirins and lie down and it'll go away. And the thing was, it didn't go away. And what we have in the Gospels is not stories of people saying, well, of course, here he is, he's alive again. We have stories of people saying, what do you mean? Don't be silly, that can't happen. They knew as well as we do. And yet, right in the heart of it all, they come back and say, it really has happened, it's completely blown us away, it's changed our worldview, and it's gone on changing people's worldviews ever since.